All right, so I'm going to start with a few questions, and I'll try and rebound on your answers. So, first question: in your December interview for France Culture, you say that you are finally able to refer to yourself as a poet, but that you don't write poems. So actually it's two questions in one. First, why was it difficult to think of yourself as a poet? And second, how can you be a poet if you don't write poems?
Thank you very much for this question, because I think I had it coming. Poetry, poems. I think poet is the one that is most saturated, at least I would say in Western languages. I speak I speak French, Spanish and English, but I don't speak non-Western languages, so I won't claim to know about those contexts. But from Latin America to Europe, through the Northern America, poet is extremely saturated with, let's say, cultural capital, with ideality, with expectations that on good days are idealist and on bad days are pompous. And so the signifier it's something that one might not want to relate to spontaneously. What I mean behind also is that for me, poetry has to do with writing poetry as text, has to do with some level of tension and combat, if not conflict, amidst language. And so all this ideality that goes around the word poet seems to be understating this. Seems to be an ideal, and it's a bit difficult because my work as a young writer was to find a way to write, notwithstanding all of this cultural capital, write sometimes against it. I'm sure that we'll have other opportunities to talk about Samuel Beckett, but Samuel Beckett talks about writing against or notwithstanding lots of those big notions. So already from the outset, poet was difficult. But I came to terms with it because this book talks about my attempt to write novels. And I love the title that Natalie gave to our evening tonight. Actually, you didn't read it. Perhaps later on that I'm a failed novelist.
No, I did read it, or some of it.
Okay, that I failed to write novels. That is to say, here the poet is somebody she's trying to do certain things with language that other aspects of literary endeavor cannot do that easily or that naturally. And with time, I tried to. I finally understood that I could identify. It's a terminology that's quite in use nowadays. I could identify with this tension and with this attempt. But this is because poet refers to. So in other words, I moved from the substantive, un substantif, the poet, to the name of somebody who's doing something, almost like the name of a sports poet. What I couldn't do, however, is relate to poetry in the sense that poetry is even more than poet, this notion of, an essence, an ideality. And I want to keep its impurity, its native, media, generic, stylistic, obviously, impurity as long as I can. So poet is somebody who's doing something. Poetry would be the result, and I don't want the result to be pretty fine.
Is it also maybe because in France, at least, when you say you're a poet, people expect a particular type of poetry, precisely. They're like verse, rhyming verse, and that's not really what you're doing. So maybe the expectation is.
So I guess that what you're saying is true, and I would say that it's still true in this country. It's still true in many countries that people expect certain things. But your question was why you say poet and why you say you're not writing poems. Yeah. Poem is the last thing. this is difficult because a poem, seems to be saying that again there would be a specific nature to a typical verbal endeavor that would end up in a poem. I'm extremely keen on the word that is coming from the 60s, which is text, writing, language. I'm really holding on to those vintage concepts and practices and a way to identify that are coming from the big deconstructions of literature and its essences. So as much as I can agree to call myself poet because the word in French has been deconstructed enough in relationship to social sciences, social practices, to art practices, poet now is no longer Victor Hugo.
Really?
It's starting. I mean, we're going to talk about, and actually it's perhaps now a good time to dedicate this reunion we're having today to the memory of a dear friend of ours, and a great French poet called Jean-Marie Glaise, who passed away a few days, and he and a few others, Anne Portugal and Liliane Giraudon and Christian Prigent, a few others of this generation have done enough since the end of the avant-garde, since the late 60s, 70s, to impose, as it were, to impose to the little realm that will listen to poetry anyway, because the literary economy in France, like in this country, is dealing with the economy of the narrative, that is to say of novels, and it won't dwell that much about poetry, but for those who are paying attention, this generation has succeeded in deconstructing this signifier enough. However, the signifier of poem keeps something that is the ballads, lyrics are poems. I see myself more as so it's a bit of a weird answer because I see the word poet in the sense that I deal with the intransitivity of language. I'm not a novelist, but I'm writing texts. Texts that can be scores for sound poetry, that can be subtitled for video poems, that can be words for people saying them on the stage. So it's a poet, but with texts.
So would poetic practice work better rather than poetry for you?
If you really ask me in terms of the word that would work is what they use in visual arts. I teach at an art school in France, and this was very different when I joined the school a few years ago. In art, they call it travail, works,
right.
Work. And I prefer this as opposed to poetic practice, work. His work is on, or etc. Okay. That it be as generic as possible, and that it really focuses on the actual labor and the act of.
So I don't know how much the audience knows about your work. I was wondering if you would say that your work is experimental, or is it actual poetry? Is it do you see what I mean? I've got the feeling that a lot of contemporary poets reject the qualifier experimental because they think it undermines what they're doing. Is it your case?
It's very interesting because experimental sounds like people who are doing things but they're not quite sure of what they're doing, which could be a very interesting thing when you're claiming to create something. Otherwise you're just unfolding a process, and that's something very respectable. It's called industrial work or it's called something else. So experimentation wouldn't be a problem as such, but I guess that the people you're mentioning are aware of the fact that it can be some sort of a weird reversed positive stigma. It would be experimental in the sense that it's trying, it's creative, but it's creative at a scale that confines them in a corner of a conversation. And I guess that this is what they want to avoid. And I could hear this in the strategy, the social science strategy of how writers are going to express themselves and present themselves to the wider audience. And why shouldn't they be thoughtful, mindful of these things? However, there's something that is nice about experimental. So it's true that if it's heard like an epithet that is going to describe something forever, experimental can be reductive. But what I still like in this word is that it's resisting. It sounds like the antonym of something that would be so efficient that it would be completely industrial. It works well, what I'm going to say now, more with novels than with poetry, but there's an industry of novel writing. Actually, devices write them better than we do now, AI. With Netflix is a novelist. Who's the best novelist? Now it's Netflix, because they have categories. Not only because they have pool of writers and subset of screenwriters, but because they have a device that does it. So the industry of storytelling, the industry of taking the mic and expressing oneself is so humongous that if experimental is something that is jamming this industrial field, then this terminology has something that is quite interesting. But all in all, it's really this tricky. Some people can feel the word experimental poetry as pretentious because it's demanding, therefore it's saying high culture, low culture. And the ticket price to enter it, which is not true, but that's how it's seen, would be seen as big. So this is why it's useful to say poet without an epithet.
Yeah, because radical is kind of the same, radical poetry.
Yeah, in radical you hear, there's the politics of this adjective that is even clearer than experimental. And in radical you hear something that wants to be, in a good sense, brutal, or even a certain sense of violence to make things appear, etc. I'm using the word poet as a Trojan horse. People are going to hear all sorts of things with it. I'm not going to tell them what I do, and then it's on them.
Okay, sounds good. So yes, we were talking about one topic of your new book, which is the idea that you would have preferred to write novels, but you failed. So can you explain? Because I mean, obviously the seminar has got this title as well, so we need to address it.
Yes. I don't know whether I would have preferred, but I had a fantasy of writing story, telling stories in a way that would. There's a lot of jouissance in storytelling. A page turner is something that you cannot stop doing, quite literally with your thumb and your index. There's something that makes people happy, that fills them, fulfills them. So you have this notion that it's working, it's fluid. Poetry can never have this. I don't think that poetry does. When it does, it's really, really creepy poetry. I mean, bad poetry. It doesn't work like that. There's no. Perhaps we can talk about this later, but I think there might be jouissance in the novel, this desire in poetry, and these are two different things. So I was drawn to, it seems like as I was fantasizing it, obviously a novelist would be here in front of me, and perhaps one of you is a novelist. Don't hesitate to tell me that I'm speaking nonsense, because I'm projecting this to an idea of a novelist. But a novelist is somebody who's going to create a narrative, it's going to have a direction, things are going to work. Obviously, not in the sense that great novelists are those who suspend all sorts of things, and not only disbelief, but suspend judgment, etc. But quite often, the ideology or the economy of the novel is like this. And so I didn't want to be a novelist in this sense, but I was fantasizing on what I was perceiving wrongly as something that is an efficiency. That's the word that really stays with me. You know, when something is efficient, that it works, it's simultaneously extremely satisfying, but it's a problem. It's a problem because it becomes something that is on its own, like those toys that we move with a key and then they move on their own on the table. And that people, again, find enjoyment in it, but it's the enjoyment that is something that is artificial, artifactual. So I was simultaneously, I think, drawn to this because I was seeing how well it worked, and also taking distance. And I think that what I'm trying to say in this, in the introduction, because you're talking about the introductory chapter of this book, is that my desire to try and do this, and the way in which something in me wasn't able to do it. I tried to. I wrote a novel when I was 20, and I tried to. But the way in which part of me was not buying it forced me to go the other way, and the other way, to put it very bluntly, in a very, very classical manner, would be, no, it's not the narrative in the sense of the signifier. It's the vehicle in the sense of the signifier. And this is what this title is trying to convey. Transitive language is something that's going to have an object, clearly defined, and it's going to operate a series of grammatical devices that is going to represent something at a distance. Novelistic, the art of the novel is a paradigm, a paramount of this capacity. Intransitive language is something that is resisting this thing. And I had a tendency to go towards not the signifier in the sense of the 1960s ideology or Mallarméan, late 19th century French Mallarméan fetishization of the signifier. It's not that simple, but and so I put the / in this title. It should be between the N and the T, so that it shows that it's simultaneously or either transitive and intransitive. Putting it there where it is, it's that it wants to have both. In other words, I would like to tell narratives, but through poetry. That is to say, through a resistance to this economy, to this ideology of the storytelling efficiency that the novel can be the name of.
Okay, well, so what do you mean by bad poetry? So, bad poetry allows you to...
Did I talk about bad poetry?
Yeah, you said bad poetry can be a page turner, like.
No,
like
I was talking about novels.
Right. Okay.
That
maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, I don't think that I said that. I don't think that poetry can be what I said. You might have. Poetry cannot be, I don't think, a page turner.
Right. Unless it's bad poetry, you said.
Did I? I'm not here to claim that I know what is bad and what is good, so I shouldn't say it like this. I meant to say that obviously one can have the thrill and the excitement of finishing a book of poems or a book of poetry and rereading it. So obviously you're going to turn pages. What I meant by the page turner is something else. It's something that is creating, and it can be very nice. Again, I'm not here above floating, judging people's practices. Obviously it can be very, very interesting, and I watch Netflix, and it's fine. I'm just talking about the ideology of this, the thing that says this is what it should be. You're not this, you're legitimate, you're boring, you're high class, you're this, you're that, you're the other. This, I think, calls for resistance, yes. And poetry is one of the name of those resistance. But
okay. If let's stay with your book for a bit. Is it right to describe it as like fictional interviews with real interviewers, a montage maybe? Or is it simply a collection of essays? And if so, what do the interviewers bring to the equation?
Yes. It's an essay in the sense that it tries to put forward a theoretical reflection through a certain type of writing that is nodding towards literature on the one hand. So this, in this sense, it's an essay. But it's at the same time, yes, I think there's a fictional interview. That is to say, I'm interviewing myself on a few occasions. After I did this, I realized that Glenn Gould had done it. Many people have done it, so I'm not the only one to be completely narcissistic. Many people are before me. The key word here is the interview, because what I was very fond of is the interlocution. This is how you say this in English? Interlocution is interlocution? How do you say interlocution?
I don't know. How do you say it?
An interlocutor? How do you do the substantive of this?
They don't know. They don't know their own language.
Interlocution is when it's not a dialogue. Dialogue is something else. It's when you're speaking to somebody, therefore you're recognizing them as on the par with you, listening. They're as well equipped as you are, and they're talking back. And what's going to be said is whatever is created in this, I hear you, I'm talking to you. Interlocution is therefore something that is essentially made at least by two persons who want to speak to each other. In other words, it's the opposite of a monologue. Monologue in the self-obsessed sense. What I wanted was something that would break the machine of my own argument. I wanted something, a shrink, a psychoanalyst would say, I wanted some other, something that would break the risk of a jouissance of an argument that is really turning. How do you say toupie, those things that you put on the table and it turns on its own?
A spinning top.
Spinning top, thank you very much. I didn't want the argument to be a spinning top. I wanted something that would break it, that would say what you're saying here is nonsense. And so this is what I wanted. And also I wanted to break a bit the fourth wall, as they say in theater. That is to say, I wanted an essay, but an essay that would show that it's also written by a poet, so that somebody who tends to make of the way in which he's saying things at least as important as what he's saying. And that form allowed me to do this. I've written theory books before. I've published my PhD. I've done books that are academic, normally academic. But a few years ago, when I was at UCL, not far from here, I heard first, at least in Europe, because it's done in the US more, something called creative nonfiction, or creative critical writing. And that was extremely interesting. This is going to take another 30 years before it gets to France for all sorts of reasons. But I used the fact that I was a bit versed in the Anglo-Saxon way of doing it, to do it. That is to say, to try to be, there's lots of neologism that I propose there. So obviously a philosopher, an analytic philosopher would read this, she would say, what is this guy talking about? And perhaps on occasion, classic poets in French would say, this is not an essay as we're expecting it. This has a beautiful prose, essayistic prose. I wanted something that would be theoretical, but bearing in mind that theory, when it's not mathematics or quantified through mathematics, is bound to be expressed with words. And as soon as you have words, whether you want it or not, whether you know it or not, there's a stylistic effort in it. So in this sense, it's an attempt at this.
Okay. So one characteristic of your work is the interplay between cinema technique and writing. You say in the book that your dream as a poet was to create a plan séquence in words. Plan séquence meaning sequence shot. I checked it out before coming. So would you say that this principle is akin to what Joyce did with Ulysses, the plan séquence in words?
When this name of this writer is up like this, there's two difficulties. One, it's very, very difficult to compare oneself with this person. And second, his work is powerful enough to require a mastery in it that I don't have. But I've read the book you're describing. I've read the monologue only enough, and I've read many things to say that there's a bit of this. It's true. It's true. It's true that there's this capacity to be simultaneously at a distance and from within or amidst and at large at the same time in it. A descriptive that is from within without being subjective in the moral sense of it, without being psychological, at least in the French sense of this. So yes, very much so. And yet at the same time, when I said I would like to write a sentence or a paragraph like a sequence shot, the idea was it's the second time I used this word, I realize, but I'll assume it, to fantasize the craft of a filmmaker. When Chantal Akerman is doing a plan séquence that lasts for 3 hours in Gentleman, but she does it in most of her films, when Antonioni does this with a woman who's tearing her fingers apart because she's saying to the guy in front of her, well, I'm sorry, I can't explain why, but I'm walking. And they're doing this in sequence shot. what fascinates me is that in cinema, because it's 24 shots a second, or it's in digital, because it's an art of duration, literal concrete duration, you're in front of something, the telling, that is to say, the raconter, is going to be a narrating. It's going to be un dire. When you're saying something in cinema, when I'm doing this, by dint of being time elapsing, I'm telling. If it's true that telling is the art of time, or going through time. So in other words, this capacity to conjoin telling and saying is native in cinema, the medium that cinema is. That's what I'm extremely jealous of. And that's what I'm after. And so when I'm saying that I would like to write like cineast makes, and sequence shot is the archetype of what I just said about cinema. When I said I would like to write as a filmmaker, as a filming, is after this that I am trying to do. And so to answer your question, and James Joyce is a very good example because he's such a meteorite that personally as a writer, I cannot dwell on James Joyce too long because I won't write anything because I'm going to compare myself and it's going to be. If I were a university professor, a scholar of a British or Irish modernism, then yeah, I would spend a lifetime. But I'm not. So in this sense, it's a bit like Marguerite Duras, it's a bit like a few others, or Claude Simon, or there's many who have done. I have to put it on the side. I read it a while ago. I remember it, but there are echoes, but they're quite faint. And I have to go towards photography, cinema, video art on occasion, but things that are translating these things. In other words, translation is an important topic of this book, and I can't translate from a writer to a writer. I don't know why. I think that I know why, because the pressure to say it nicely, to emulate, to imitate, to write like, is massive. You have to do it quickly and then completely forget it so that it becomes an unconscious moment.
Right, okay. Thank you. Another characteristic of your work is your use of something that resembles stammering, or at least I see it more as a process of stumbling over words, as if they were obstacles that you are tripping over. So what's the deal with that?
I love how you've said it. Recently, I was presenting this book in a French university, and I wasn't expecting what I was asked, but two scholars told me, Jérôme, your relationship to stammering, although I put inverted commas when I talk about this, might be quite misunderstood by people who actually stutter. I don't know exactly how you say this in English, but in French humanities, you have this relationship towards abilities and disabilities and validism, and relationship to validating abilities as opposed to, or as a manner of saying things about people who are not seen as valid. I had never thought of this, and they told me, we know we've read you enough, we've heard you read and perform in public to see that you're not doing this as a matter of making fun of, but aren't you appropriating something? And obviously I was not going to talk about Gilles Deleuze's concept of bégaiement because it wouldn't have helped me in that situation. So this is why I'm extremely fond of stumbling over words as obstacle, or tripping over words. It's the first time I hear it like this, and I made a note of it. Thank you very much for this, because it's not that I was trying to stutter as a person who has a speech impediment would. The whole thing was, again, a relationship to French as a language. My mother tongue, in the literal sense of the term, is Mexican. Is to say, an imperial language through its ex-empire. My father tongue is French, France French. And although I spent my childhood in various countries, I went through the French public school. And the French public school system is such that the relationship to the language, French society is such that the relationship to the language is quite, not hysterical as such, but it's quite strong, a bit agitated. And so this whole thing about saying a few syllables and seeming to be stuttering was that I was trying through my poetry was trying to invent ways to turn around the violence that are implicit in the way in which France teaches its own language to itself and sees its own language. French is extremely political as a language. There's an example I use quite often to express what I'm meaning here. One of the core centuries in the 15th or 20th centuries of French as a language is the 17th century. The 17th century is the century of the highest moment of the monarchical absolutist power by a king, in particular called Louis XIV. And this is when you have Versailles, and this is when you have all sorts of top-down centralization and organization of French identity and French culture. And there's one guy there in particular called Boileau, who's a poet and a theoretician who writes in Alexandria in those 12 feet, etc. And he says in a very famous couple of verses in a book called L'Art Poétique, which is a method. It's a poem written Alexandrin, 12 feet verse, telling people how to do things intellectually. And in this text, at some point, he says that if you're not clear, it means you're sick. The real criteria of being intellectually sane, in the psychiatric sense of the term, although he doesn't verbalize it like this, is clarity. And clarity is a capacity to organize your thought seamlessly. That it's absolutely after which you've ordered it. And when you're speaking, we must not see the stitches. It has to be completely clear and organized. If you go to Versailles, you will see in the gardens of Versailles what I mean by this. There's the gardener of Louis XIV, a guy called Le Nôtre, who's going to organize the bushes in ways that are extremely chiseled, organized perfectly, and they're to be seen from above, and you will see a beautiful drawing, a fish, or I don't know what that is. If you confront this with an English garden, you would see all the difference. This country is not the last when it comes to organizing things perfectly as well, but it does it in a way that is seamless, or the seamlessness. The English, and I want to talk about English because I don't know about. The English seamlessness is different than the French seamlessness. The French seamlessness is very logical, symmetrical. And I think the relationship to what is not clear, seamlessly clear in France, is something that is always suspected from being either cognitively deficient or politically dubious. You don't have a Lewis Carroll in France. You have Antonin Artaud, or an answer like that. Here you have Humpty Dumpty, who's on the... So in other words, the logics can be rephrased. The gardening can be rephrased, or the violence of the organization can be rephrased. The fact that there's an order that will be all the more efficient, that is invisible, that is to say, it's culturally completely, integrally taken for granted, is different in those. We could talk about Germany, I don't know how they do it there, but the US does it differently. But in France, it has to do with, and Boileau is a good example of this, what is well conceived, I'm going to say it in English, what is well conceived is expressed clearly, and the words to say it come to your mouth naturally. I've just translated those two verses. When you think of the sentence, it means that whenever you're not in the situation where you have not 4 or 5 meta levels from within yourself, that is to say from your body, your perceptive body, when you're not at the nth meta level, where you can actually see yourself, choose the words so as to express clearly what you're saying. If you're not there, France says, you're deranged, you're mentally deranged, and you're politically problematic. So that was my antagonism, or the what I was sensing from the French classical culture. You could say, well, there's not only the 17th century in France, there's another one, there's the 18th, there's 19th. But when I couldn't write efficiently like a professional storyteller and produce a smooth narrative, so I couldn't go towards the novel, I look at poetry, but poetry is also with this big ideology of the Alexandrine. The Alexandrine, Victor Hugo, Charles Baudelaire, which is one of the core of French modernity, writes in 12 feet verse. So you have this very strong thing, and so how do you get out of it? Well, one way was the stuttering. That is to say, to break the syntax and to somehow escape this corset, this straitjacket that is in it. And then perhaps there's also a more corporal thing. The stuttering had to do with synesthesia. I found out later in my life that I had tendencies towards synesthesia, so to say several things at once, which is one of the definition of poetic stuttering or stumbling over words. To say several things at once is to go as fast as your physical perceptive apparatus. For instance, here I'm seeing you, but I'm seeing the taint of the light, I'm hearing the bird over there, and all of this is collapsing in one dense. To make a narrative of this is to slow it down. You slow it down so that people can read it and they will recompose it in their head. Proust is a good example, Joyce is a beautiful example of this. I think that I didn't have the patience, let alone the talent, of those two writers, and I wanted to do it very fast together. The last thing I would like to say is that I love what you said about stumbling or tripping, because there's something of falling, of the free fall, of Buster Keaton in his films. Remember the films by Buster Keaton? I would like to, or I was trying back then, find myself writing like he's trying to survive a train or a skyscraper in New York.
So I think you told me before that you discovered Deleuze after you had started this tripping over words. Because when you discovered Deleuze, you must have been really overjoyed to read about stammering and the fascism of French grammar. And,
it's true, but I discovered Deleuze, weirdly enough, when I was around, 20, 21, 22, before I started the PhD, through his books on ontology, mainly a book called Difference in Repetition, where he doesn't talk about stammering. He talks about stammering in a book, as of, I think, Capitalism and Schizophrenie, and then in the late 70s. So I first discovered him, what he had to say about deconstructing the Cartesian subject and the body. And it's true that then when I got to his thing about structuring, I was not surprised.
In 1,000 Plateaus.
In 1,000 Plateaus, yes. It's true that I was not surprised.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about Jean-Marie Glaise, the poet who unfortunately died a few days ago. He had coined the word post-poetry, which I'm very interested in, and this was to refer to the innovative practice, a poetic practice of a number of 21st century writers. Do you consider yourself a post-poet? And, sorry, yeah.
No. But do you want to finish your...
No,
okay.
I finished.
The prefix post is very interesting. One bit is very exciting, so I would spontaneously go towards it. The second one is problematic. And for the same reason, post means after, or once we're done with something. So it's a cut in a chronological line. And so there's the first thing that is very drawing to it. It's a bit like a punk movement. Say, fuck that, pardon my French, fuck that, let's do something else. Let's be done with this. The heck with the inheritance, the debts of the past that we're supposed to carry. Why should we be faithful to something? So there's a very strong this idiosyncratic gesture of an emancipatory gesture from inheritances they were supposed to be responsible for. But by dint of that gesture, which is cutting with the past, paradoxically it reinstates the past and it keeps us in a timeline. It keeps us in a chronology. When you're a post-poet, you're a poet of today, paradoxically. And so you're remaining in yesterday, yesteryear, today, tomorrow. It's the same, more or less, problem, perhaps differently, with futurism. With futurism, I don't know how you relate to Marinetti and those people, but for me, it's like the locomotive of a train that is completely autistic and says, I don't care about no future, basically. The future is no future, something quite punk in it as well. So for all the thing that says, for all the emancipatory aspect of Jean-Marie's concept, post-poetry for me is very interesting because it's a way of liberating oneself with all the idealities of the poet. The problem is that, and I've discussed this with him on quite a few times, the problem with that is that it can also re-identify the very gesture that you're doing to escaping or getting out of the nomination in that way. Prorogates it, a nomination. So to answer your question, I think Jean-Marie Glaise was really a very striking figure of the late 20th century, early 21st century, figure of a poet, very talented, extremely innovative and exciting poet. But he was also a passeur, he was a transmitter, he was a great professor. And he was extremely generous in bringing the radicality and the experimentalism, those two words really fit him, of the 70s to young writers of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, who then took on this force to create their own things. And for me, a passeur in a university is someone who not only teaches the great books, as it were, but gives the keys, quite literally, of the library to the next generation. It says, now it's your turn to rewire it exactly as you want, rearrange the library according to your own things. And he did this very much. And so post-poetry was emancipatory. And because he was this very generous personality, it didn't become, I would say, a mot d'ordre. How do you say un mot d'ordre? When you have a demonstration here, with a political demonstration, at some point they're going to have they're going to shout a mot d'ordre. Let's say, let's all go to Buckingham Palace, or the heck with the Prime Minister, or a mot d'ordre is where political collective is rallying around. It's not a slogan, but it's a rallying cry of sorts. So as a mot d'ordre, post-poetry is quite interesting, because it managed to say that we could get out of old-fashioned idealities and the politics of it. Like any rallying cry, one aspect of it is deterritorializing, another is reterritorializing. One aspect is creating a minority, another one is to him until his last breath. My relationship to him proves me that he was a deterritorializing force, for sure. Yeah, he
created in the late 20th century, created this Centre d'études poétiques in Lyon, at the University of the École Normale Supérieure. And he had this website which I discovered in the early 2000s, with loads of recordings of new poets, and it was a fantastic introduction to contemporary poetry, and I'm forever grateful to him for this, because that's how I spent the last 25 years of my life. Final question.
Yes.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to share with our audience about your book or poetry more generally?
Right. Well, yes, there is one. But I mean, I don't know you in the sense that I don't know what you're working on and what brings you here. I guess that it's the interest with literature and these types of things, but I don't know what you're working on. But I would say this. When I wrote this book, I wrote it because I felt that I was at a moment of my work where I wanted to, when you publish a book, whatever you're saying to yourself through this book is, you hear it quite well because you're saying it to whomever is hearing you and reading your text. So it's a moment where you are talking to, obviously, your readers. You share with your readers, but you also share with yourself in quite an intense manner. And I was trying to say to myself what I've said to you, that I am going to live as a writer in this formalist. Formalist is a word we didn't use before. You said experimentalist and materialist, or radical. I am a formalist and I am a materialist. I believe that my medium is first and foremost a materiality, that language signifiers are things, sounds and shapes, that they carry meanings, but this meaning can never be disentangled from the materiality of it. And I believe that a work of art is nothing if it's not a form, if it doesn't have a form and a formal strength. This being said, I was wondering how I could also pursue the conversation in also the way of, how shall I say? In this book, I try to more or less not explain myself, but explain some of the things that I'm trying to do, which is a gesture that is a bit bizarre, because you could write a theory of poetry, so you're claiming that it's going to have all sorts of effects way beyond you. You're claiming that it's theoretically sound, irrespective of your case. This is not what I'm doing, because I'm doing theory, but I don't believe in top-down theory that claims that it's universally valid. So I'm doing theory, but not in this sense. On the other way around, you could say, why is Jérôme trying to explain us his life as a poet? I mean, are we sure we care for this? And why would he have to justify himself? There's something that's quite weird when somebody tries to explain what they're doing. So I try to problematize it. And what I'm trying to problematize is the relationship between a very strong formal desire that has been mine since I started to write poetry, but also a desire to be not heard or read. I will be extremely happy if I am, but this is not for me to judge, but a desire to say that language is not mine only for me to do what I want. So it's a bit of a paradox. I'm a formalist poet. I believe in cut, the fact that a writer, she's going to do it in this way, not in that way. And it's not that intention, that her biographic intention that counts. It's the fact that the way she did it is going to draw the attention of her readers. So I believe in the strength of form. But on the other hand, I think that all of this energy would be worthless if it doesn't one way or another encompass other people. Let's call them readers, but let's call also language or culture at large. And so this is what I'm trying to do in this book. When I'm writing the first books of poetry that I wrote, and still to that day, when I'm writing poetry, I'm not thinking of how it's going to be received. It's true. I don't think of the reception. I think of the reception once the text is seen like this, and I'm going to read it out loud, yes, but I'm not writing in order to, I pay attention to how it's going to impact those who are going to read me. But with this, it was a way of saying, if poetry has to be radical, formal, formalist, then on occasion, let's say every 25 years, we can say why we think that in other manner. And this is why I wanted to be creative critical writing as opposed to just explain myself. Like I would be asked by a cop, Mr. Game, now tell us why you've been doing this and that and the other. The how do you say aveu en anglais when you're called by the cops and you're saying that you did it? Confession. It couldn't be more far or further remote from a confession. It has nothing to do with a confession. I'm not confessing why I've done very radical things or formalist things, but I'm trying to bring formalism in a wider conversation, and perhaps also, since you're asking me this this question, because I feel that on occasion the relationship to formalism can be perhaps a bit more difficult now than it was. I hope that a new formalism, this is why I tell my students in the School of Art where I teach, a new formalism of, for instance, TikTok will emerge at some point. A new formalism of Instagram will emerge. That's to say there will be some distance with the medium that will allow the author to be ruthless with the medium. That's the definition of formalism. So as to come up with a strategy through which the medium can express something more intense than just the functioning that is supposed to be had from it. I'm not sure I'm seeing it at the moment. I'm seeing many things that are using devices, but I'm not seeing one that is throwing the device on the wall to see how it survives when it's exploded, like painters have done, like musicians have done. I mean, think of the early 20th century. We still have to see this. And so I guess that this book is also a way of saying every art practice, and poetry is one of them, has to at some point confront its own toolbox. Again, not as a priest, not as a shrink, not as a policeman, not as somebody who's going to tell you how to do, but confront them, to create a gap, a space. And this is why theory is important. And this is why it's important that poets write theory, that they don't be theorized from above or from I don't know where. It's super important that practitioners, garagiste, boucher, charcutier, every practitioner should have and is obviously capable to have a distance from themselves and talk about themselves in the sense of theorizing themselves. This is also why I wanted to do this. One, because I think that the language art that poetry is completely socially quite often irrelevant. Quite often it's going to be very hard to get heard, yet has a power, including political, that is second to none. And so we have to find a way to make this also heard, in this sense. And to answer your question a bit more precisely, I realized, going through this book to prepare our event tonight, that quite often the voice that is speaking, that is to say me, I guess, as a writer, is saying quite often that it's lacking. It's lacking and it wants to be not filled, but handled by someone, something else. Not someone in a physical sense, but by another practice. Quite often the poet there says, I don't know how to do it. I'm ill-equipped. I think I'm at the end of my wits. And I'm asking cinema, I'm asking painting, I'm asking music, I'm asking social sciences, I'm asking curatorial practices, I'm asking other practices to rewire me. So the lack here that I'm talking is not in the sense of the Lacanian sense of some ontological lack, etc. But I think that one thing in this book is that the poetics that is there, I claim, is the opposite of a self-sufficient poetics, which is paradox because I just talked about formalism with a flavor of autonomy of art in a modernist sense. So there's a part of me that, yes, believes in the autonomy of art. There's a part of me that believes in the modernist desire to break the alphabet and rewire it and recreate one and have a gesture that is quite expressive. We're going to call it phallic. And there's another part that is the absolute opposite of this. Not in the sense of a castration or a lack, but it says, I'm not self-sufficient. I'm not omnipotent. I need to be redone, reshaped, rewired by other grammars. So there's a bit of a weird thing. If you ask me, this is paradox. That the more this book believes in the possibility of phrasing things, the more at the same time he says that if this possibility is to be carried out, it will be through the other. The other, not only the other body, the other subject, but the other practices.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jérôme.
Thank you.
Fascinating, and thank you for your generous explanations and answers. I hope I wasn't too much of a cop.
Not at all. Thank you very much. Not at all. Thank you very much for your presence and your interest.
for your questions and comments and remarks. The floor is open. Yeah, Dane.
Thank you, that was fascinating. So I was particularly interested in, you say you see poetry as doing something linguistically, formally, etc. that goes beyond the smoothness, the efficiency, I think you said, the kind of formulaic nature of the novel and prose. And I can quite see that. But isn't there a danger of, as a poet, for any poet, that you then, there's the potential pitfall as a poet of being identified with a genre that's often perceived as elitist, linguistically inaccessible, hermetic. I guess in the French tradition, particularly since people like Mallarmé, but there are others like T.S. Eliot or whatever. And I can quite see that you were arguing against that at the end. That intersection with other art forms and technology is a way of rewiring and potentially democratizing poetry. But how, I guess it's a struggle because of that perception, which is too simplistic, but that poetry is something that's inaccessible to the mass, to the public. And when, of course, as you know, the tradition, if we go back to medieval times, it was the opposite.
Absolutely.
It was the troubadour, it was the oral
Absolutely.
tradition. So how do you get around that contradiction? I mean, it can't be, and you explained it very well, but how do you get around that?
It's an extremely fair question. It's a very important question, because there is this risk. This risk exists that poetry be called, or this type of artistic practice be called elitistic. And I think it's a critique that, from a sociological point of view, is absolutely founded. It's very fair criticism.
Yeah.
And in the other way around, I think it's to go even more in this direction. It's also important to say, reach out. For instance, we're in a university, and I'm sure that this exists in the University of London, but at the places in the US where I teach, every body in the university that receives money, public or private, has to show how what are they doing with the money is being brought to the attention and can branch out and reach out. There's a word, but I'm censoring it now for this type of policy. And so it's true that we have to make sure that it can be heard. And it's true that, like any corners of high culture, poetry can be a resource whereby individuals or constituencies tend to try to accept themselves from the common. So this critique around elitism can be founded. I agree with you. I would try to say that it's not in terms of radicality. This is where it was interesting, those words. We used radicality, experimental. Then I used formalism and materialism. All of this don't have to exclude a certain type of simplicity. And by simplicity, I'm not obviously saying that it's going to be simple so that people who don't have the proper cultural capital will be able to understand it. That would be absolutely dreadful. What I'm saying is that it has to be inclusive, yet, and this is where it's weird, it has to be inclusive, however way in which it's written, but it must never play the ideology of cheap inclusivity. This I would stand firm. It has to make sure it's not elitistic in the sense of excluding, but it has to be demanding. I think the one thing we have to remind ourselves is that to be respectful of somebody is to be demanding. When was being demanding a proof of lack of respect? It's exactly like teaching, educating. You have to make sure that you find a way to express clearly to the person you're interacting with that you respect them. You have to make sure that you're as clear as possible. You have to also show them that you're going to intake whatever they're saying. But then the sheer fact of being in a classroom where something that we do not know is going to be shared and acquired requires the fact that we're going to input whenever we can. So I would say that the real violence is this device. It's the a demagogue type of thing. I want to give the public what it wants because it loves it. So it would be both things: no elitism, not saying the people cannot. I'm not going to write like this because this is in nature law. Certainly not. But I'm not here to, how shall I say, please a crowd. No, I'm not. If what I say can make that a crowd, whatever the size of it, because a crowd is not a number, it's a feeling, is happy, and I believe that its energy is growing, I will be the first to be extremely satisfied and proud. And so I will interact with the crowd. But I'm not entering the room so as to. So it's a mixture between respect and demanding, and also the simplicity and the modesty to propose something. But I think what you're saying is crucial, because it's something that can be put to poetry whenever it's written. Although there's also some people write with a simplicity that makes them extremely deep and extremely demanding, and this is what we should be aiming for.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could say something about whether you think your poetic practice or textual practice is anti-representational. So I thought there was an underlying question about representation, especially from what you say about post-poetry and the novel, because I think they say that post-poetry is not related to the content of the poem, it's not related to the expression of emotions, nor a kind of lyrical form, but more about the framework and the context in which poetry happens now, right? And I do feel that a lot of the contemporary poetic texts tend to be much more abstract, or not this representation of I'm feeling like this. You know, if you think about Baudelaire and even Apollinaire, Éluard, whoever, you know, in earlier periods, people have this very simplistic idea that the poetry somehow has to represent the emotions of the poet. And I just don't find that much in a lot of contemporary French poetry. But at the same time, I thought, because you said you tried novel writing, I think the success of the novel is precisely because the novel is so representational. And when you go to book talks about novels, the writer is always talking about how it relates to some of their own experiences, right? Or their thoughts about social inequalities and other very concrete things we see in the world. So I wonder, because you said a lot about materiality or the text, and in some way the process maybe, whether you think what you're doing is anti-representational. Sorry, my question is very long.
Thank you very much for this. It's very interesting. Because it's true that we talked about the terminology I just rehearsed, but it's true that we haven't talked about motif or a figure or the subject or the self that you're saying can be less visible and something that would be anti-representational. There is, in the French context, an antagonist. This antagonist is what we could call committed literature. If you take from the late 19th century to the second wave of the avant-garde, 1960s, 1970s, and if you accept from there the early surrealism and the early plonge after World War II, all of literature that tries to be formally innovative, that is to say, literature on the left, has a big super ego in the head when it comes to motif themes, and figures called communism, in the sense of committed literature, where what is represented has to be very clear and morally, politically, historically also very clear. So the school of poetry, my generation of poet, I'm 55, the generation of poet that I am is started to write in late 1990s, is one of the first that took some distance with what we could call this overdetermination in terms of motif. It had to represent something, We talked about Apollinaire. Let's skip 10 years. Let's talk about Aragon. Louis Aragon is one of the founders of surrealism, but he's also, between 1934 and his death, an organic member of the Communist Party, a guy who writes a novel in 5 volumes called Les Communistes. And this table is less thick than the novel. I mean, the type of prose the guy writes is, formally speaking, abysmal and ideologically extremely creepy. So in this sense, yes, you're absolutely true. Right. There is in the French context, because of that, because of the hold of a leftist motif background to experimental literature. Let's call it a superego. We were talking about psychoanalysis before. That is such that the second wave of the avant-garde and the post-avant-garde, whilst being on the left, are going to completely deconstruct this quite a bit, and they're going to say, you're talking about emotions. When a text is expressing an emotion, obviously there's 1,000 ways to do this, but quite often in the French context, you're going to hear 2 things. You're going to hear the I, subjective psyche, ego that is having the emotion and wants to transfer it to the I of the reader, and the emotion. The avant-garde that I'm talking about that are going to, I'll talk about myself in a second, but they're going to be important for me, are not going to be interested in what the emotion is about. They're going to say, could we just tune the I for a second? Can we snooze it? We have enough of the I is saying me, myself, and I are having an emotion. Me, myself, and I are fighting through this emotion. Me, myself, and I are thinking that this, that, and the other. And the reader's going to read this and say, well, I'm recognizing myself. There's a bunch of I's, and everybody's happy to be their I's. So it's true that it's important for those who didn't have the mic to have it. It can be very useful to create communities. But in the French context, where you had an experience of a massive collective direction of the good through the emotion and the representational system, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. The reflex was anti-representational and not anti-emotion, but anti-individualistic. Subjectivism. It's true. That this was, we're trying to switch it off, to tone it down, to unplug it, because we were all stuck up there somehow. Now it's very, very different for obvious reasons. The notion of identity has become a political turf for all sorts of good reasons, from racial studies to gender studies, obviously. To such an extent that now the type of poetic discourse that is not as committed as the 70s, but still wants to have a socialist dimension heard, is saying, how do we do this anymore? Because we're told that we should go through bodies, specific bodies in specific instances. Now, yes, now to say I is political again. To say my I, your I, his, her I's are going to do a community of I's is very political again. And so the relationship, there's a politics of emotions. And so it's very important to represent, but I would finish my answer by saying that I think that this is also part of the problem now, because the representation is quite literal. It's not only me, myself, and I, in the sense of me politically answering abstractions that have been canceling me for the last 3 centuries. This is a very fair politics. But this is being done now where how shall I say, more than the aesthetics or the industry of the I or the emotion conveyed, is an industrialization of narcissism that gives a 50-50 chance. I see this in the art school where I teach. On the one hand, it's one of the most political generations I've ever seen, who tend to have the questions that you just had, saying, bon, okay, formalism is quite well, but how do we gather community? How do we gather momentum? On the one hand, but on the other hand, is also something that quite often is but has issues with a tension, a logical tension between subjectivism, I didn't call it narcissism, but a subjectivism, very strong subjectivism, and a relationship to form. It's interesting because it's a bit as if you were echoing the previous the previous question. I don't know if I've answered your question correctly, however.
Yeah,
Tell me.
there's no correct answer.
Correctly in the sense that I've addressed it.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Any other question? Yeah.
I've got lots of questions, but I'll try and keep it simple. So, as a practicing poet, for years I subscribed to the idea that not all verse is poetry and not all poetry is verse and so on. I just wondered, because I'm looking at hybrid forms of writing, I just wondered how you're positioning your argument in relation to, for example, the prose poem, obviously there's Baudelaire, but there's more recent versions. And then just thinking about, the novel isn't always a linear narrative
Obviously.
piece of work, mentioned Joyce. So how do you think about hybrid forms? There are other forms like the vignette, flash fiction's kind of in that zone as well.
I think you're describing where I would like to be. I think you're way ahead of me. I think that you're capable of having this coexistence, cohabitation between a few things. And recently I was told exactly the same thing by, she's a novelist, you're a poet. She's saying, Jérôme, why are you so, not hysterically, but making big, huge things and saying that there's a big conflict? Why don't you weave ways to be? And I feel, answering you what I answered her, that I did very much like to, and I believe that this is very, very possible. The prose poem is a very good example. But also there are certain novelists, for instance, Sebald, or for instance, I don't know, Thomas Bernhard, who are capable of inventing ways that are simultaneously narrative and also very intense in terms of flashes of forms, etc. I think, to answer your question, that this is very much, Natalie said that she invites me every 10, 15 years, but in 15 years I'd love to have written what you're capable of right now. So yes, I would love to do this, and I think it's a way forward.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay.
All of you are, how are you involved with or connected with UL or Birkbeck, apart from those who teach here?
Well, the students, and
Yeah.
then I don't know, there's some people I don't know. You a student?
Elsewhere, a student of Hugo Azarhad.
Yes.
So,
Perfect.
Oh, right.
I might have a question, but it's not formed in my head, so I apologize in advance if I'm going to go on a rampage of rambling. But my question is this idea of temporality that came out quite often in this conversation, both in terms of like the cinematic effect of engaging with the continuousness of the possibility of a continuing discourse.
Yeah.
And the other, with the idea of a poem, which is more than other genre, I feel really engaged with both potentiality and of being infinite and its limitation, because it seems to me that the poem is what is a very minimum amount of what a poet wants to say, and what is not said is what is the most important, I do feel. And I think I'm really interested in how that connects with the potentiality of intermediality. The idea of having other medium feeding into that haunting, that absence, which is constant in poetry, what could have been said or what is haunting the text. So I think what I'm really interested in is probably how to really explore the possibility for other medium and other languages in terms of texts, both visual, to interact with poetry. I think about stand-up, spoken word. So when the performance comes into play, and how songs can be considered also forms of orality that involve intermediality. So I guess, yes, how intermediality fits into and comes into play with this idea of haunting and absence and presence and temporality.
This is extremely rich question. Thank you very much. Not at all. It's extremely interesting. You talk about intermediality fitting. I quote the notes I took into the absence or the haunting of or that is poetry. So you have two big things in one. That it's true that it's this notion of haunting or absence in poetry is interesting. Not as a ghost that would be perfect, and that poetry would be the photograph negative of. I'm hearing what you're saying in the sense that poetry is struggling with the fact that sayability is not that easy, and when it is, it's for bad reasons, and that in other words, it's working with this tension between absence and presence, and I very much recognize that. And so when you're saying that this absence or that this haunting could be linked with intermediality, what I'm hearing, what you're saying, I'm going to translate it with my words, is that poetry doesn't suffice. Poetry is not enough. And it's a very great news that it's not enough.
Yeah.
One, because they won't become fascist. Only fascists think that they're enough. And people who tend to think that they're enough tend to become fascists. So it's a very good antidote to fascism to think that we're ontologically not enough. We're ontologically dysfunctioning. We're ontologically not all of it. There's a tension there that is creative and that is politically emancipatory. And the fact that it's not enough means that it's going to create links with other practices, other devices, other media. And that when I was hearing you, I felt that you were retranslating the question that was posed by you in your work, because what you were saying in intermediality, you were saying in two types of writing in the same space. And I feel that this is crucial. I think this is one of the way forward in an epoch of saturated by media and by narratives and by slogans and by poems that we could call advertisement slogans. That we're saturated by a caricature. All this that the two of you are offering us some sort of an antidote to this. That might go with this notion of space, because absence and haunting is also space or gap, or not being marred by the desire to fill everything, or to remplir is fill, isn't it? To fill everything and to make sure that everything is filled. I think that this is absolutely crucial. So when you're saying other medium means that, again, my medium, i.e. language, is not self-sufficient and is not omnipotent. I'm obsessed by this notion. I think that it's absolutely crucial, either within the page or amidst media. And the second thing that I find quite interesting with intermediality when I work in this, because a large part of my work is in intermediality, is the idea of translation. That is to say, in a mixed media installation, what they could be text, printed on the wall, projected on the wall, or recorded, things, objects, images, etc. There's going to be a space in between that the spectator / reader / spectator is going to operate. She's not going to fill it, but she's going to operate it. It's as if it's performing the fact of reading, the fact that you have letters or chunks of signifiers that you link together. In other words, the process. It shows that the artwork is a process as opposed to a thing or a substance. I think it's very, very important. Song. Recently, I released an LP, an EP. An EP is an LP, but small, I guess. No, it's a record like this. Of sound poetry. On one side of the record, I'm reading poetry, and there's a guy, a friend next to me, who's playing the drums, and he's doing this very, very loud, so as what I'm saying not to be clearly immediately hearable. And this device, I wanted my words to be able to go through the power of the drums, and I wanted the energy and the beat of the drums to always compete with whatever meaning I was trying to suggest. But in the other way, in the other one, I'm with a electronic DJ, and she is creating all sorts of beautiful loops with what I'm saying through her device. And it's pretty weird to go back to what you were saying, that you were talking about song as a medium, because quite often when I was doing sound poetry, I was adamant that I was not a singer. I was saying I'm not singing. But the more I hear the true tracks of this thing, the more I show it to people who are musicians, they're saying, well, you're singing. It's a way of singing. It's a way of... and here, obviously, I'm not going to compare myself to the author whose name I'm going to say in a second, but recently someone showed me on YouTube Jack Kerouac reading fast with Jasmine. It's absolutely amazing. So singing, yes, I think is... But you see, I had to come to it avoiding the industry of singing. I didn't want to, although I'm in the land of pop, and pop is great, and I'm a fan of a Nobel Prize in Literature called Bob Dylan, so song can be very nice, but songwriting is also a huge device with a huge industry that can impose itself very, very, very heavily. How do you go through it? I'd like to get to song, but without saying, okay, I'm going to write a song, and I'm going to sing in a band, because this is not a desire I have. I guess I'm too old for it. And also, it would be entering a grammar, and I would rather come to it like what you said, by approximation, by nearings, by being near to something else, and with some gap and space in between. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you indeed for coming.
It was great. Thank you, Jérôme, again for your answers.